Greetings. Our most recent assignment has asked us to read over this Summerhill School book written by A.S. Neal. And essentially what Summerhill School tried to capture was a very progressive educational movement. And so we've been asked to read through this in hopes that we can better understand kind of a real life example of what progressive education could look like. Basically, kind of the underpinnings of Summerhill schools as this sort of progressive school, the whole idea was to allow children to be very free and have lots of choice in their education. So the way that Summerhill schools is described is being as very, very democratic system, and children had the absolute choice of what they did. Lessons were available to them each day, but students had the choice as to whether or not they wanted to attend. And then a lot of their free time was essentially whatever their choice was, whatever their interests were. They were certainly assisted by teachers and staff, but were never forced or coerced into attending a certain class or selecting a certain career field or engaging in a certain activity. The founder of this school, that was particularly Summerhill schools, the school was started in 1921, and this Alexander Neal in this book talks about his successes and failures and generally how the school functioned. Really kind of an interesting read. We were asked to compare and contrast between this progressive movement and also our current education system, and certainly there are many differences. In the book, Neal talks about being held accountable to his current government, but really only in the matter of whether or not he was going to be listed as like a reputable school, which didn't necessarily matter to him because his reputation he felt was coming from the success of his students and from parents that sent their students there. So did indicate some concern over that, but certainly not to the degree that schools face each and every day. I think that's probably the most stark difference, is that general accountability piece. Certainly now, especially in the United States, we force our schools and our teachers to be held highly accountable for student success. And certainly a system like this that could allow a student to go 2 or 3 years never actually attending a formal academic course or engage in any studies of any kind would just not be something that would be allowed in the United States, at least not if a school would like to receive any government funding, certainly. So definitely some stark differences between those two schools and philosophies. So just some of my personal reflections about the book. I certainly like the idea of this free range education. It's very romantic. It seems like surely ideally if we could pull all these constraints off of students, that we might see some success from them, especially hoping that they would be self-motivated, self-driven, and I definitely like the ideas that Neal has in that, his belief is that we want to create happy students. Happy students aren't the ones that end up in jail or prisons or, being a menace to society in any way. Happy people generally engage in behaviors that they find enjoyable and, morph well into the community and society as a whole. I'm not really fond of some of the things he discusses related to problem children. He certainly is very open and honest about his successes and his failures, but when he talks about his failures, he will say things like, the student didn't come to me soon enough. So they'd already been well established in other ways of being taught, had difficulties with authority, and so definitely or had already engaged in public education, and so then really struggled to be in this more free, democratic environment. He also talks about how essentially this doesn't work for students with low IQs, and that he basically wouldn't accept students with low IQs. And then also talks about mental health with students and how That's kind of something different. He talks about disturbed students, and how, it's a much more difficult system to deal with those students, and that this system may not be the appropriate one for them. So his discussions that are just kind of scattered throughout the textbook hit home for me, because as a school psychologist, and someone that deals with special education on a daily basis, that's really something that I see as being a major issue within our schools. So for me, progressive education that is unwilling to work with students with low IQs or students with very severe behavior problems or mental health seems like a really restrictive environment, and I can't imagine our regular schools, our public education system would probably experience much more success if we did not have students that were more challenging to work with in that way. I'm also a little skeptical of how his theories and his system would apply to schools today, because he does talk about, for example, once he quotes, there's a sophistication in the new generation, and he talks about how in his later years of running the school, how students seem to be, especially that would come from the United States, would indicate certain complexes that they were aware that they had, and how they were more aware of some of these mental health issues, or had already established some of this real world knowledge, and so basically felt like they were they were going to be harder to teach because they were already aware of some of these things. So some of his very childish, maybe not childish, but some of the tricks and the things that he did for his other students that were effective, he felt like the students that he had many years ago were more naive than what his current students were, so it might be harder to interact with them in the same way as he dealt with children, many years before. Again, as a school psychologist, I also wish I could have seen more research-based information. Again, while it's a great read and I appreciate the book, my concern is always that someone else will pick it up and instantly start feeling like this is best practice. And there's certainly some practices in here that I can see being related to current research, but some not as much. And so I hope that anyone that reads the book will certainly do so with a grain of salt and will consider that. I appreciate his take on humor in education. I think there is not enough humor in education. Sometimes we take ourselves far too seriously, and as a result, we definitely engage in way more power struggles than are necessary, and cause so many more problems. As he says, I do not want to ever see a student struggle in their education or be bored with their education, and certainly us providing a little more humor in our lessons on a day-to-day basis just could not hurt. And of course, always helps us establish relationships with students, which gives them, more of an inclination to want to learn in our classes. I also appreciate his patience with students. Some of the stories that he describes in the book are just fascinating to hear, and makes you want to be in that moment to see how well he kept his cool. I think that's really neat that he had such excellent patience with these students who I'm sure were very difficult to deal with. And most of all, I appreciate his honesty. I think the book does an excellent job where he does admit that things don't always work out, how he learned from those experiences, and he's very honest as well about his upbringing and how that kind of affected his way of teaching. And within that honesty, I hope that other people that read the book see too that he didn't necessarily have it all figured out in the beginning. It didn't start with this grand theory of how things should function, and kind of learned along the way and adapted his educational practices as such. So overall, Summerhill School, it was an excellent read. It really did bring that progressive education to light, and I certainly will love to hear everyone else's reflections on the book as well. Thank you.